And now for today's event. The high cost of housing is a constant topic for discussion in San Diego and California. Tim McQuade is one of the nation's leading authorities on real estate economics. He holds the California Chancellor's Chair of Real Estate and Land Economics at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. His research on rent control and affordable housing has been published in the very top economic journals. And we're delighted he's offered to share some of his insights from his research with us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tim McQuade.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Great thanks to Jim for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure. It's an honor. And I'm going to be talking to you today about how to address housing affordability in the United States and trying to tell you what we know about various policies that have been discussed and what does the data tell us about the effectiveness and the impacts of the policies that are in the actual policy discussion. But I first would like to set the stage a little bit. Housing affordability is an issue. It's an issue in California, but it's also an issue in the United States more broadly, and it's an issue globally. In the United States, rent-burdened households are at an all-time high. So if we look at the households who are moderately cost-burdened, those who are spending more than 30% of their income on rent, and those who are spending more than 50% of their income on rent, what we define as severely cost-burdened households, this has been significantly increasing over the past 20 years, going from about 15 million households to 20 million households. And if we talk about the share of the population who have any sort of cost burden related to rent, that's increased from about 30% up to around 40%. And we know that this is an issue in California, right? It's part of the discussion. You're hearing about it in the media all the time, but this issue is actually geographically widespread. In fact, more than a third of renters are cost burdened in every state in the country. The issue is heterogeneous. There are states where this is more of an issue, California in particular being an extreme outlier, but this is a national issue. And it's also an issue that is, for example, confronting Europe with increasing cost burdens related to rent. This is also not a burden that is equally shared. Okay, this increase in the cost burden has disproportionately been impacting the lowest income households, as you can see here. Okay, in terms of the residual income, the amount of income that households have left after they make their rent payments, you have seen significant declines for the lowest income households, and they're really suffering this in a disproportionate way relative to households in the higher income segments. And this matters. This matters because that means for this household, not only do they have less ability to consume, they have less consumption, but it also significantly increases their financial fragility. If they, for example, face income shocks, now they might have to take on debt, which increases the probability of bankruptcy, and it increases the likelihood of eviction. And we know, for example, from some excellent work by Winnie Van Dyke, a wonderful professor at Yale, and her co-authors, that eviction has very negative persistent impacts. It impacts your lifetime earnings, it impacts your health, you're more likely to end up in the hospital, it impacts your mental health, it impacts your children. Okay, so the fact that we have these increased cost burdens and it's actually materially impacting the lowest income households is certainly an issue that we need to think about how to confront. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what the policy landscape actually looks like in this area. So there's a number of policies and a number of suggestions that have been put forward as to how we address housing affordability and housing instability in the United States. So the one that probably you've all heard of is, of course, rent control, right? Rent control, let's actually just constrain the ability of landlords to raise rents on their tenants. And I'm going to talk a little bit about rent control and what the impacts of rent control are. But that's not the entire policy landscape. We also have affordable housing subsidies, and these subsidies can go to either tenants in the form of Section 8 vouchers, just subsidies towards their rent payments, or we have subsidies that go to developers, for example, in the form of tax credits, what we call the low-income housing tax credit, which incentivizes them to build affordable housing and then rent that out to low-income tenants at below market rents. But beyond subsidies, a lot of the policy discussion, especially here in California, has focused on the supply side. Well, And the idea being, let's just build more. And if we can build more housing, then we can lower rents. Okay, so some of the policy discussion is also surrounding increased supply, for example, through zoning regulation. Let's address zoning constraints that are impeding the construction of new housing. And California has made some progress on this issue, in the form of California SB 9, which is basically has the goal of eliminating single-family zoning in California, allowing for more multifamily construction, and also streamlining the zoning process, making it easier for local zoning boards to actually approve new housing. And this was California SB 10. There's also been some moves to allow local homeowners to put ADUs on their properties, which should also help to increase the supply of housing. We also have some innovations on tenant protections. New York City, for example, in 2017, introduced a new law that gave right to counsel, which basically said to tenants, we will provide you a lawyer to help you with your eviction proceeding, just as you would get in a criminal trial. Okay? It's a right to legal counsel in an eviction proceeding. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about some work that I'm doing that's really, instead of thinking about risk to the tenant, but thinking about risk to the landlord, okay? And trying to address, maybe there's things we can help with the landlord and trying to understand the risk that they face. And if there are interesting policies that we can use to try and insure against some of those risks, will that actually lead the landlord to be more willing to actually provide housing to low-income tenants? Okay. But what I first want to talk about is rent control. Okay, rent control continues to occupy significant space in the housing affordability policy debate. The repeal of Costa-Hawkins was on the California ballot in 2018, 2020, and 2024. So Costa-Hawkins is a law in California which impedes the ability of local municipalities to impose very stringent rent controls. Okay. However, despite all those initiatives failed, right? But despite Costa-Hawkins being state law, there has still been quite a bit of movement in terms of introducing local rent control statutes in California. So for example, in 2022, rent control statutes were introduced and passed in Antioch, California, Pomona, California, Kingston, New York, and Richmond, California. Recently, Pasadena, California also passed rent control. All these rent control is also not confined to California. In 2021, St. Paul, Minnesota, for example, introduced a very stringent rent control regulation. Also, rent control has been introduced in Orange County, Florida, and Portland, Maine. Okay. Not all rent control is created equal. Not all rent control laws are the same. There's actually a taxonomy of rent control, what we call first generation rent controls, second generation rent controls, and third generation rent controls. First generation rent controls are what we all sort of think about when we think about rent control. It's classic rent control. It's what we had in New York City following World War II. These are controls that impose hard rent caps, setting a maximum amount that the landlord can change. Basically, the rent is specified by statute, and the landlord essentially has no control over the rent. These are not as common anymore, and they were more common historically. What then evolved from first generation rent controls is what we now call second generation rent controls. Second generation rent controls regulate rent increases and apply regardless of vacancy. So instead of imposing a hard cap, it limits the amount that the landlord can increase the rent on an annual basis. So in the United States, St. Paul, Minnesota passed a second generation rent control in 2021, although it was slightly rolled back in May 2025, given some of the deleterious effects it actually ended up having on housing supply. Second generation controls are also more common in Europe. In particular, France, Germany, and Spain all have forms of second generation rent control, where they apply basically to the amount that the rent can be raised on an annual basis. What we have here in California is actually the loosest type of rent control. It's what's known as a third generation rent control. And this is basically by statute. Costa-Hawkins requires that the rent control that any local municipality can pass in California is of a third generation type. And so what does that mean? Number one, it's going to exclude newer construction, okay? So for example, properties built after 1995 in California are exempt from any rent control regulations. And the idea here is you want to exempt sort of this newer construction so you don't impede supply. And moreover, in California, we have what is known as vacancy decontrol. And what this means is landlords can reset the rents to market rents when a new lease is signed. So within a tenancy, when you have a current tenant, there are limits to how much you can raise the rent. But if your current tenant leaves and you get a new tenant in place, then you can reset the rents to market rent. And then with that new tenant, then there are limits on the annual increases. Okay. A number of economists have studied rent control. This is an old topic in economics, and the potential drawbacks of rent control have been pointed out by numerous economists. These drawbacks include the overconsumption of rent-controlled housing, the misallocation of housing to heterogeneous tenants. This is, for example, the classic example in New York City of a 70-year-old widow living in a 4-bedroom apartment. Okay, why doesn't she move to a smaller apartment? Well, because she's protected by rent control and she doesn't want to give up her apartment. There's also been work showing that rent-controlled apartments have potentially negative spillovers on neighboring houses. And then there's this classic idea that rent control implies that there's going to be a neglect of required maintenance and just underinvestment in the property. Why should I invest in the property if I'm not going to be able to capture that investment in the form of higher rents? However, rent control advocates point to significant benefits to tenants. When you actually talk to housing affordability advocates, they say, well, here's why we like rent control. Here's why we think it's beneficial. First of all, what they will point out is that long-term tenants may have significant neighborhood-specific capital. They have a friends and family network. Their kids are going to schools in the local neighborhoods. This might be where they work, so they have proximity to their place of employment. And so these people don't want to leave their neighborhood, and they're worried about rent increases that are going to displace them, that are going to force them to leave. Now, classically in economics, we say, well, how do you insure yourself against rent increases? Well, there's a way you can do that. You can buy a home, right? The classic way to protect yourself against rent increases is through home ownership. But of course, for many, especially many of these low-income tenants, financial constraints make owning a home quite difficult. So what these rent control advocates will point out is that rent control is effective at providing a form of insurance that tenants greatly value because of their neighborhood-specific capital and which is difficult to obtain otherwise. So there has been this literature on the potential benefits and costs of rent control, but what was sort of missing from the literature was an empirical study that could really try and understand what are the causal effects of rent control. And the reason is if you sort of just say, well, here's a city that introduces rent control and let's look at what happens, there's a classic problem in economics that we call an endogeneity problem. And the basic idea is just, well, what was going on at the same time? Why did they introduce rent control? And how do we separate out the effects of rent control from what was going on at the same time? So what I did in a paper back in 2019 that was published in the American Economic Review is we had a clever way of trying to understand what are the actual effects of rent control on tenants, landlords, and housing supply. And to study that question, we looked at the rent control in San Francisco. Okay? And there's some very nice features of rent control in San Francisco that allow us to try and really understand what the effects of rent control are on the local housing market. So for those of you who don't know, San Francisco rent control began in 1979. That was when rent control was originally passed in San Francisco. And it was of the 3rd generation type. Okay, and so the way that meant that it excluded any new construction. Okay, it was going to exclude anything that was built after the passage of the law. So rent control in San Francisco covers all rental units built before June 13th, 1979. And as I said, it was 3rd generation, so it capped annual nominal rental increases within a tenancy, but not between tenants. But here's the key part. When it was originally passed in 1979, there was an exemption. Okay? In fact, it exempted small multifamily housing with 4 units or less. This was actually part of the law. And the reason was that they kind of wanted to go after the large corporate landlords, but they didn't really want the small mom and pop landlords to face the burden of rent control. But what happened over the next decade is this small multifamily housing was increasingly sold to larger businesses. And so what happened in 1994 was that there was a ballot initiative. Okay? There was a ballot initiative to remove the small multifamily exemption from rent control. And that initiative passed by a narrow margin in 1994. And what that implied is that all of a sudden in 1994, any small multifamily building that was built prior to 1979, all of a sudden was assigned rent control. But any building that was built post 1979 continued to not have rent control. So what we did in this paper is we brought a number of data sources to bear to study what the impact of rent control was, not only on the tenants, what actually happened to the tenants, but what did it do to the housing supply of San Francisco in the long run. Okay, so in other words, we wanted to think about what did rent control do to the tenants, what did it do to the landlords, and what did it do to the long-term supply of rental housing in San Francisco. To that end, we brought together a number of data sources. Okay, in particular, we have Infooter, DataQuick, we have data from the assessor's office and the planning office. Okay, and essentially what this allowed us to do, we introduced this data set in Infooter, which is very nice because it allowed us to know who the tenants were living in these buildings in 1994 and track them over time. We could see who was living in the various buildings, and then we could see where they went afterwards. And by having DataQuick and data from the assessors in the planning office, we also could see what happened to these properties over time. Did they get torn down? Did they get renovated? Did they basically get converted to condo? We could see the life cycle of these properties as well. And so our empirical strategy was very simple, okay? Exploiting this very nice feature of the law that basically in 1994, it was only those properties that got built before 1979 that actually got rent control. So what I'm showing you here on the map in purple are non-rent controlled properties, and in green are the properties that basically were assigned rent control in 1994. And our strategy was very simple. We were simply going to compare tenants living in small multifamily housing built prior to 1979 to those tenants living in multifamily housing that was built post 1979. And I'm going to think about what happened to these. What did the life cycle of these people look like? Those who were essentially randomly assigned rent control and those who were not assigned rent control in 1994. And we'll compare tenants living in the same zip code, okay, and those who had basically been living in the property for the same amount of time with the same length of tenancy, okay? And so what we found is that, in fact, rent control was quite effective at preventing displacement, okay? It was effective at preventing displacement from your address, but also in terms of preventing people from being displaced from San Francisco itself. And the effects were large, on the order of 13 to 20%. Those individuals who were randomly assigned rent control were 13 to 20% more likely to remain in San Francisco relative to those individuals who did not receive rent control. And in fact, when we did this decomposition, we found that the city displacement effects, basically the idea that you were less likely to be displaced from San Francisco, was driven by racial minorities. Okay? The fact that you were not getting displaced from the city, that was concentrated among racial minorities living in San Francisco, which was one of the stated goals of the law. So rent control did provide a form of insurance. It was successful at preventing displacement in San Francisco of racial minorities in the face of significantly rising rents over the following period. However, the landlords did not remain idle in the face of rent control. There were equilibrium effects. And one kind of interesting piece of evidence for this is that in those tracts in San Francisco where rents were increasing the most, actually the results flip. Those people who in rent-controlled housing were more likely to leave their current property than those not in rent-controlled housing. In other words, in those places where the insurance value was the greatest, actually the results flip. And so that is very suggestive evidence that the landlords are doing something. Okay? And so the question is, well, what were they doing during this time in these high rent appreciation areas? Well, one is they can just make your life difficult. Okay? They can make the tenant's life difficult and try and force you to move. You could also do the owner could move into the property, known as a move-in eviction. They could also just pay you to leave, and that happened, right? And remember, the landlords were incentivized to get you out because this is third-generation rent control. If they could get you out of the property, then they could reset the rent to market rents. So what you actually saw, and there's data on this, is that you saw significant transfers of landlords to tenants in terms of monetary payments to just get them to leave the property. And the other thing that you could do is you could do what is known as an Ellis Act eviction. You could basically kick the tenant out of the property, conditional on you taking that off the rental market for a period of 5 years. Okay. But what you could do then, if you took it off the period of 5 years, is you could potentially convert it. You could convert it to a condo. So what ended up happening to housing supply in the long run in San Francisco? Well, it wasn't great. So in the long run, we saw a 15% decline in the number of renters living in San Francisco. In other words, there was a 15% decline in rental supply in San Francisco, and an 8% increase in owner-occupiers, in owners. But that 15% decline in renters masked an even larger decline in the number of renters that were living in rent-controlled units. There was a 25% decline in the number of renters living in rent-controlled units. What is this saying? This is saying that 25% of the rent-controlled housing stock that existed in 1994 is now gone. It has disappeared. And so where did it go? Where did all this housing go? Well, what happened is rent-controlled landlords significantly converted to condos, okay? On the order of at a 10% higher rate than non-rent controlled landlords, who basically didn't convert to condos at all, essentially. And so they converted to condos. They would take these properties, they would take them off the market, they disproportionately applied to the conversion lottery, and then they converted this to owner-occupied housing. What they would also do is they would tear down their buildings, and then they would put new construction in place. Why? Even if it was still rental housing, now it was built post 1979 and is now not covered by rent control. So the point is, the landlords did not remain idle. They did not simply take rent control as given and say, well, that's just the way the world is. No, they responded. There were equilibrium effects that in the long run led to 25% less rent controlled housing and 15% less rental housing in the city. Moreover, I have additional work showing that these effects were driven by corporate landlords as opposed to small individual landlords. In other words, it was the corporate landlords that were more aggressive about converting their housing to avoid the law. And thus, in some ways, individual landlords were disproportionately left holding the bag. There's also evidence of racial heterogeneity, with minority landlords being hurt more than white landlords. Minority landlords were not as able to basically do this conversion and get the capital needed to do this conversion as white landlords. So in many ways, it did protect the tenants in 1994, but it led to less housing supply. And in terms of the landlords, it was a regressive policy. If we wanted to sort of say, well, what was the ultimate impact of this reduction in housing supply? What did it do to the city in the long run? Well, what we did in some follow-up work that we have, we used a structural model, just basically a supply and demand system, to translate the observed supply response that we estimated into an equilibrium response on market rents. And what we found is that the reduced supply due to the imposition of the law led to a citywide increase in rents of 5.1%. The present value cost of this was $2.9 billion, with 42% borne by future renters of the city. Okay? And so what this implies is that at San Francisco rent control, this change that was passed in 1994 reflected a significant transfer from future renters of the city to renters in 1994 on the order of about $1.5 billion. Okay? And so one of the kind of lessons of this work is that when you introduce tenant protections, rent control is a form of tenant protection, it looks good on paper, and there can be a rationale for it, but you have to understand that there might be equilibrium consequences, okay, which might work against the law. And so there's a nice recent paper which provides another example of this. So Winnie Van Dyke, who I mentioned previously, professor at Yale, has looked at the right to counsel law in New York City. Okay, this is again a law which basically entitles tenants to legal protection when an eviction proceeding occurs. And what they found is that this did lead to a less incidence of eviction. Okay, so evictions actually do go down in those zip codes that basically get this protection. And moreover, eviction takes longer. Okay, so eviction filings goes down and eviction becomes longer on the order of 3 months. But what they all then found is that rents go up. Okay? In these areas that were highly exposed to the law, rents increase on the order of 2 to 3%. So once again, you see a general equilibrium response that when you introduce these tenant protections, there can be equilibrium responses which potentially will work against the intended goals of the law. This is not to say that tenant protections don't have a role, but in economics, we have to understand that these sorts of interventions can have equilibrium consequences, and sometimes those equilibrium consequences in particular in tenant protections can raise rents, impeding housing affordability, which was the stated goal of the law in the first place. So alternatively, instead of thinking about tenant protections, one thing we might do is focus on supply side interventions. Supply side interventions that address potential frictions that impede access to housing by just not having enough housing available, by basically causing frictions in the ability of developers or landlords to provide housing to tenants. And so the two frictions that I want to talk about today are the risks that landlords face and regulatory frictions in the form of zoning. Okay, two important supply side frictions. And so if there are any landlords in the room, that maybe there are, I'm sure you would not be surprised to hear that being a landlord entails significant risk. There is risk involved in being a landlord. What are some of those risks? Well, there could be unexpected maintenance costs. You also have turnover and the length of the vacancy duration, right? Your tenant just might leave and then you have to find a new tenant, and it's going to take some time to basically get a new tenant in place. And while you don't have a tenant in the apartment, nobody's paying you any rent, but you still have your costs and your financing costs. There's also regulatory risk, right? We've seen examples of regulatory changes. Basically, the local government could just come in and impose rent control. That's a risk that you face as a landlord. And then, of course, perhaps the most significant risk, especially for the low-income segment, is non-payment risk and eviction costs, right? Basically just the risk that your landlord, that your tenant is not going to be able to pay you, and then you're going to potentially have to evict that tenant, which could be that could take time, and there's going to be costs involved with that. And so the point here is that if landlords face all these risks, well, there's this notion that we have in finance, which is that, well, if I have more risk, I need to be compensated for that risk. I need to get higher returns from my investment to basically compensate me for the risk. And this might be particularly true for smaller, undiversified landlords who are disproportionately provide the housing in the lower income segment. If I'm small and undiversified, then I'm really exposed to the risk that my particular tenant is going to not pay me rent, and I can't diversify that risk across a large portfolio of properties. Okay? In economics, we have a technical term for this. This is what is known as an example of an incomplete markets problem. Okay? We're all sort of facing this idiosyncratic risk with our own tenants, and there's not a good way that we can sort of self-insure against this risk with each other. So what would this imply then, right? So if you face this risk and these risks are larger in the low income segment, then that suggests that landlords might need to be compensated for this risk, right? And they need to be compensated for this risk in the form of higher returns, in the form of higher rental yields. And ultimately, the fact that landlords need to get higher returns and higher rental yields will translate potentially into higher rents for the tenants that the tenants have to pay. And this is actually true. So there's a very nice paper, which I actually just discussed in London a few days ago, which shows across multiple countries, the United States, Belgium, and Netherlands, that the net rental yield and total housing returns are declining in net rent. In other words, in the low income segment, housing returns are higher and rental yields are higher. The rent to price ratio is higher. Okay? The fact that landlords are demanding higher returns in the low rent segment is suggestive of the fact that they are being compensated for the risk inherent in providing housing to low income tenants. And indeed, the non-payment risk is significant in the low income segment. So there's a nice paper by Humphreys et al. That sources a unique data set of privately owned rental properties in low income neighborhoods in Midwest USA. It covers 6,000 low-income tenants between 2015 and 2019 and provides information in the timing and amount of non-payment for each tenant. The upshot is, if you don't have voucher tenants, if you have tenants that aren't protected by any Section 8 voucher, then the incidence of then you only collect about 86.2% of the owed rent. In other words, the incidence of default is around 14 to 15%. So the risk of non-payment is significant when you are renting to the low-income segment. There's also significant left tail risk. Generally, in a non-payment event, it's not uncommon for you to basically not receive 6 months of rent. By the time you can actually get an eviction process through, you might lose basically half a year of rent. And there are people who will lose the entire year. So there's significant left tail risk. So this raises some important questions. Do landlord concerns over non-payment risk constrain tenant access to private rental housing and access to housing in high opportunity locations? Does the fact that this is a risky proposition and landlords need high returns impede the supply of housing for low income individuals? And does it prevent them from accessing good jobs in high opportunity locations? If so, can government intervention provide a form of landlord insurance that benefits tenants? And can this be done at reasonable fiscal cost? Can this be designed in such a way that people aren't going to game the system, right, and impose large costs on the system? So what I thought I would tell you a little bit about is a recent paper I have which studies the VSAL program. Okay? This is an explicit rent guarantee insurance for landlords that was introduced in France in 2016. Okay? It's called the VSAL program, or the Visa for Housing and Employment. It covers up to 36 months of unpaid rent and is offered by Action Logement, a publicly funded employee union. So this is basically like a semi-governmental institution in France. And it was initially reserved to those below the age of 30 and expanded to very low income earners above 30 in late 2021. And the way this works is basically a tenant in France can basically get this VSAL guarantee, and then they show up to a landlord with the VSAL guarantee, and it indemnifies the landlord against any non-payment risk. Now, you might be saying, well, that's crazy, that's nuts, because then why does the tenant ever pay the rent? Well, actually, they've thought about this. And what happens is if non-payment occurs, then VSAL pays the landlord directly, but then VSAL holds a claim against the tenant. And then the tenant owes that back rent to the VSAL scheme, and the eviction rights then transfer to VSAL. So if the tenant basically doesn't abide by their payment plan with the VSAL scheme, then the VSAL scheme can evict them, and they also have ways to garnish wages. Okay, so this is really an explicit insurance scheme for landlords. And while it provides liquidity relief for tenants, right, that back rent is still owed to the VSAL scheme. And ultimately, the VSAL scheme will evict those tenants if they don't abide by their payment plan, which does happen. Non-payment risk is substantial in France for four particular reasons. Number one, even more so than in the United States, there is non-diversification of landlord portfolios. Also, France has a very lengthy and complex eviction process. You might not be surprised about that if you know anything about France. Generally, eviction takes about a year in France. And in fact, in France, there is something known as the winter truce, in which you are not allowed to evict anyone 5 months out of the year. There are legal restrictions on security deposits, and there are no credit scores or credit bureau information. So prior to the introduction of VSAL, what would landlords do? How did they try and protect themselves against non-payment risk? Well, the primary thing that they did is they used individual guarantors. Okay, so 50% of private sector landlords required one prior to the introduction of VSAL, and this was generally provided by parents or relatives providing pay slips and tax returns and guaranteeing the rent. This was perceived as reinforcing generational inequality because, for example, immigrants and low-income individuals in France would have a very difficult time getting guarantors and thus accessing private rental housing. The VSAL scheme really took off after 2017. And what I'm showing you here is, remember, it was only available to those individuals who were below the age of 30. And currently, the VSAL scheme covers 1.2 million contracts in France, and covers a very significant share of the private rental market for those below the age of 30. So what we wanted to understand then is, well, what happened here? What did the introduction of the VSAL scheme do in terms of access to private rental housing and in terms of access to good locations in France? Did it facilitate what we call moves to opportunity? Did it let low-income individuals and immigrants, non-EU immigrants, access better education, better wages, better job opportunities, better locations in France? And to do this, we're just going to exploit the detail of the law, which is that it was only available to those age 30 and below. So what we're going to do is we're simply going to compare what did the trajectories of those who were, for example, age 28 and 29 look like to those who are age 31 and 32. Did those who got the benefit of the law, who could apply for the VSAL insurance, do they get greater access to private rental market housing? And do we see directed moves to opportunity? So to answer this question, we are going to bring 3 data sets to bear. We have actually the tax registry data from France. We also have census microdata, and we have the confidential administrative VSAL data, which actually allows us to measure costs. We can see the actual fiscal cost involved with this program. First of all, non-payment is significant and connected to economic fragility in France. Among the people that we see in our data, we see about a 6% non-payment rate, which is significant, and up to 8% for lower income individuals, somewhat in line with what I told you earlier in terms about the incidence of non-payment. It's substantial in France. This is a significant risk that these small landlords face. However, at the same time, it's very difficult to predict. When you sign the lease, it's very difficult just based on the observed characteristics of the tenant to know whether this person is going to default or not, right? So this is a real risk that is idiosyncratic at the time that you sign the lease. It's a significant risk, but you really can't predict whether the person that you get is going to be the one who defaults on you. And so what would we find? Well, we find that indeed, VSAL did increase access to rental housing, and the effect was significant. So if for those individuals who are 28 to 29, relative to those aged, for example, 31 to 32, it increased the access to private rental housing by about 1.5 percentage points. In terms of a percentage basis, that meant that it increased access to private rental housing by about 5%. Okay? And for people below the age of 30, you saw an increase of about 5% in their access to private rental housing. The largest effects were for non-EU immigrants and the low income, just as you would expect, because those were the individuals who would have had a difficult time getting a guarantor in the first place. For them, we saw that it was 2 percentage points, and because their baseline access to private rental market housing was much lower, this is actually a 15% increase in the access to private rental housing for non-EU immigrants in France, which is a massive effect. So, and the reason is because these are the people who would have, that non-payment risk would have been quite significant. But remember, VSAL is indemnifying the landlord against that risk, making them much more willing to not screen these tenants out and actually provide housing to them. We find that these effects were driven by household formation. So this was actually driven by people moving out of public housing, moving actually out of homelessness, which is not very large in France, but we do see some effect of that, moving out of public housing, moving out of their parents, moving away from roommates and actually forming their own house. So this effect was not being actually driven by people already living in a household, but actually by household formation, by people basically getting out there and forming their own households, now in private rental housing. And finally, VSAL did facilitate access to valuable locations. It created moves to opportunity. In particular, what we saw is that for those individuals, again, age say 26, 27, 28, 29, right below the age of 30, they increasingly directed their mobility, that is where they lived, to areas that had higher rents. They got access to higher rent locations. They got access to areas with greater population density. They got access to areas with more amenities and a higher living standard. And they got access to areas with higher wages. Okay? We also see that these people were much more likely, for example, to be able to move to Paris. Okay? And so what this suggests is that when you have a situation where landlords face significant risk, as they do in France, and as they arguably do in places like California, where non-payment risk is significant and the eviction process can be lengthy and complicated, then when you when you do what in economics is called completing the market, providing insurance against this risk for these landlords, then they become more willing to actually provide housing to low-income tenants and at lower rents and with less screening. And so what this suggests is that policymakers, even if the policymaker only cares about the tenants, the policymaker might not care about the landlords in the first place at all, right? We've talked to the Visal scheme. The point of this Visal scheme in France is not to protect the landlords. That's not their goal, right? But the point is that by providing some insurance for landlords, you can create opportunities and better equilibrium outcomes for the tenants that you actually care about. Okay. The final thing I'd like to talk about today is another supply side response, which is zoning reform. So in California, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of attention applied to zoning reform, right? The fact that we should relax zoning, eliminate single family zoning, for example, to allow just for the construction of more housing. And this is just basic Econ 101 logic. If I increase housing, then I push down rents, okay? And that should improve the affordability landscape. But as with many things in economics, it's potentially more nuanced than that. So number one, the Wall Street Journal takes the view that yes, zoning reform is the solution. If we have zoning reform, if we do upzoning, if we basically eliminate single family zoning, allow more multifamily housing to be built, then we're going to get quantity increases, and that should push down prices. They write ordinances routinely ban the construction of multifamily housing and require homes to be built on large lots, artificially boosting the price of shelter. However, there are detractors. There are detractors of zoning reform. And what some of those detractors say is that zoning reform does not actually increase quantity. It just leads developers to build expensive housing. Okay? In other words, we don't get quantity increases, we just get quality increases. There's a quote from Restore Oregon in 2017 saying, upzoning gives developers a free pass to demolish good, modest price homes and replace them with much more expensive homes that will do nothing to ease the affordability crisis. And finally, some say that all zoning reform is going to do, it's going to line developer pockets. Okay, that basically all of the benefits are just going to be captured in a distributional sense by landlords. Okay, all the benefits are just going to accrue to landlords. So that's an empirical question then. We would like to understand, if we do zoning reform, what can we really expect to happen in terms of the supply response? How much additional housing are we really going to get if we do zoning reform? So I have a new paper which looks at exactly this question, and what we hope to actually provide as a public good to the real estate profession as a large, which will help to answer these sorts of questions. And indeed, we want to address the impacts of zoning reform and to understand the supply response. And to that end, we're going to bring together new data. So actually, we have very detailed data at the parcel level in Cook County on parcel level transactions, the exact zoning requirements at the parcel level, all of the historical redevelopment activity we've seen on that parcel, all the renovations that have come in, if something got torn down and something got put and something new got put up, we see all of that at the parcel level, and we see all of the historical parcel characteristics. And we're going to combine that then with a model that's going to use observed redevelopment activity to actually estimate the fixed and variable development cost associated with construction. Okay. In other words, we're going to use what is known as a revealed preference approach. We're going to look at what are developers actually building, right, given their choice set. And by observing what they actually do, I can try and back out something about their costs, about how expensive this is. And then this is going to provide us then a laboratory to estimate the supply response of various proposed zoning reforms. Okay. The first thing I want to point out is that Restore Oregon might have been onto something. If you look at the observed redevelopment activity that we actually see in Cook County, a vast majority of it actually doesn't increase quantity. Okay? We do not see an increase in units coming from the vast majority of redevelopment activity that we actually see in Cook County. Now you might say, okay, but that's just because everything is built up to capacity, right? Given the current zoning regulations, this is just, if it's single family zoned and you come in and you renovate a single family house, well, I can't put another unit on it because it's single family zoned, right? There was no spare capacity to actually increase the number of units. But what we find is that this is true even when zoning was not a binding constraint. Okay? And when we restrict data to lots where zoning allows for more units than are currently built, we still see that the majority are actually not increasing quantity. It's basically just upgrading the quality. You're just building something of the same number of units, but you're just upgrading it. All right, so there is something to the notion that when that zoning is not just that there's just a ton of sort of new units sitting on the sideline there, and if only zoning were to be relaxed, then we would get those units come online. Even when zoning isn't a constraint, we still see a lot of this redevelopment activity as not actually increasing quantity. So how do we actually do this? So the idea is pretty simple. We're going to use transaction prices in zoning regulation to define the developer choice set. If they were to build on this, given the zoning regulations, what could they actually build? We can define that choice set. And because we see observed transaction prices at that time that are going on in the city, we can estimate the potential revenue from redevelopment activity. And from this actually allows us to get estimates of development costs. And we also see the prices that are paid by developers to the current property owner, which reveals the surplus split between developers and current property owners. Ultimately, when we do this, we get single family and multifamily cost estimates. So for example, we recover a variable cost, a fixed cost, and a cost of doing a lot split. And these estimates we think are reasonable and indeed are in lines from external estimates from a company known as RS Means. But what I want to point your attention to is the two sort of key counterfactuals that we do in the paper. So what we're going to do is we're going to do one experiment where we're going to do triplex upzoning. And then I'm going to do another experiment where we reduce the fixed cost of construction by 25%. The idea being that we're going to reduce the red tape and the cost basically associated with doing the entitlement and things of that sort. So when we do triplex upzoning, what you see, this is basically saying that on every single parcel in Cook County, I'm now going to allow a triplex to be built. I'm going to allow for 3 units to be built. On paper, that would generate about a 40% supply response, okay, in Cook County. But when we actually run it through our model, taking our costs into account, we only get an increase in units of 2.34%. Okay. When we reduce fixed costs by 25%, when we come in and when we streamline the entitlement process, right, making it easier to just get basically get this thing off the ground and start building. When we reduce that by 25%, we get no impact on units at all. Okay. This simply isn't large enough, a 25% reduction, to get those properties over the hump. And so what do we learn from this? It says that zoning reform, while part of the solution, is, at least in Cook County, but what we've seen also is true in other municipalities, is unlikely to provide a silver bullet to the housing affordability crisis. It can be part of a solution, but it does not seem that there's just this entire wave of new housing that is sitting on the margin, that is waiting to come online, that would come online if only we would just relax zoning. That doesn't seem to be the case. Moreover, the details of the reform matter. If you just do, for example, triplex upzoning, but you don't, for example, increase the amount of the floor area ratio, then that doesn't pencil. Okay, so the details of the reform matter. But most fundamentally, what we're finding is that it's not that everything is just on the constraint and there's just a wave of new housing that will come online if you relax zoning. In fact, fundamental cost drivers, such as labor and material costs, imply that many proposed redevelopment projects fail to pencil in many areas of the city, even if zoning were to allow them, which again is consistent with the previous data that I showed you, which is that when you actually look at observed redevelopment activity, even when they have that spare capacity, a lot of that is not increasing units. And so what this suggests is that we need innovation that is to actually increase the economies of scale in housing construction. Indeed, housing construction productivity has stagnated over recent decades. There is a nice paper coming out of Harvard, which looked at how housing construction productivity, defined as the amount of units produced per employee, while initially in the early part of the 20th century, productivity kept pace with general manufacturing productivity and auto productivity, has completely fallen off the cliff in terms of not keeping pace with auto and general manufacturing. And if anything, in recent years, housing construction productivity has declined. We have not changed how we build housing, in the same way how we basically have changed how we build cars and do manufacturing. And if anything, in the housing sector, it's become more inefficient. So to conclude, housing affordability continues to present a major issue across the United States. Much of the policy discussion has focused on rent control and other tenant protections. These have a place, but as I've argued and shown you, hopefully, they come with general equilibrium effects, which sometimes can work against the intended goals of the law. Low fiscal cost schemes that to protect undiversified landlords may facilitate improved access to rental housing in high opportunity locations, as exemplified by the innovative VSAL program in France. Zoning constraints are part of the problem, and you do get some additional supply on the margin from relaxing them, but doing so is probably not a silver bullet and a one-stop solution to the housing affordability crisis. Indeed, housing affordability is a complex issue and will almost certainly require a multifaceted and creative solution. Thank you very much.
Thanks for a wonderfully informative talk, Tim. We have time for a couple of questions. We'll be using the one microphone system again. So if you would, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. And then that'll give Tim 20 seconds to catch his thoughts while I bring the mic back to him. So.
Thank you. Interesting talk. How is VSAL funded? I get that they collect rents eventually, but you got to have some capital up front in order to provide guarantees. So is that government funded? Is it union funded? What's the kernel that starts that program?
Great. So that's an excellent question. It's currently a combination of union funded with support from the French government. Currently, as I said, it is actually free of charge to tenants and landlords. There is a discussion currently about potentially raising fees on landlords to finance this scheme. But one thing I didn't mention is that the scheme really has pretty low fiscal costs. We have access to all of the VSAL internal data, and the cost per induced move is about 500 to 1,200 euro, which is about 3 to 7 times less than, for example, voucher programs in the United States. So it's currently being funded through the combination of the government and the employee, but it is really low fiscal cost. And the reason is it is unlike vouchers where you have to provide the support to everyone. This is only ex post. You only pay out in the event of non-payment. The landlords really care about the non-payment event, but remember the VSAL scheme is diversifying across the entire pool. And yes, it is significant, but at the end of the day, it's about 6 to 8% non-payment. It's an insurance program, right? It's completing the market, but there is some discussion, given how effective it's been, that maybe there will be some fee imposed on landlords going forward.
Time for one more question.
Did you look at any rent control schemes that had a more nuanced exemption, rather like a 5-year or 10-year for new construction versus everything after 1995?
So I personally haven't. San Francisco doesn't have that feature. There have been a number of studies following our study in 2019, there have been a number of follow-on studies that have examined rent control in other cities. So for example, there's a nice paper which recently came out which looked at rent control in St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul, Minnesota, as I noted, was a second-generation rent control and did not have the sort of exemption on new construction. That was actually just put in May 2025, but when the study was done, it evaluated when it didn't have that new construction exemption, and if anything, found more severe supply effects than we found. It's also been studied in Europe. It's been studied, for example, in Barcelona, Spain, as well as in Germany. And those also tend to be second-generation rent controls with even more stringent regulations, and once again tends to qualitatively find similar supply effects that we found in our 2019 paper, but often of a order of a greater magnitude, simply because again they're more stringent regulations.
I know there's more questions, but you all know.
This is
about
Dan
time.
Epstein.
Tim will be here for a few minutes afterwards.
Can I make a comment?
Come back September 4th for investment strategy. Thanks so much. Tim.
Of course, thank you. Oh, thanks, Greg. That was fun. Yeah.